Hey everyone. So, in preparation for your blog post about critiques, so that is your sixth blog post where you are going to, or is it your fifth? I don't remember at this point, but you're going to be performing a critique on anything that you'd like that's related to your project, and you're going to be performing one of the critiques that I mentioned in the list or one of the critiques that I mentioned here in this lecture. Um, and so while I do provide you with a link that sort of defines all of the critiques, I thought it might be useful for me also to record this lecture. These slides are actually from a lecture that I gave in person in my face-to-face composition class, but I thought I could just sort of modify it a bit for you all to hear. And hopefully, if you're confused about critiques or theory, because I know it's a really dense concept, this will be helpful. So because it's a modified version, please forgive if you see any like names from names of people. These are students from my other class. So we'll just sort of ignore those. Okay, so before we can really talk about the different kinds of critiques, the different kinds of theories, and I'm using theory and critique interchangeably because essentially here they're meaning the same thing. We really want to get a sense of what context is. And so, context, according to Webster, is this idea that circumstances form the setting for event, statement, or idea, and um, I'm sorry. So the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. So essentially, what that means is we can't understand something unless we know sort of more about the event that's taking place, when this piece was produced, defining words that are unfamiliar to us. So, context is a way for us to better understand what it is we're looking at. And so, the example that I provided is this video, and I'll only show you a brief clip. All right, so maybe I'll leave a link to this if you'd like to watch the whole thing. So this is a song from a Bollywood film by Baijiro Mastani. And the idea here is if I were to ask you what's going on in this video, for those of us who don't know the film, don't know the language, we presumably would say something along the lines of, I have no clue. I need context. And so, context, in the same way that Webster has described it, would be me telling you perhaps what the title of the song means. So, Binga is an activity that's performed by women, and it's for this occasion of Mangal Lagor. It's where the woman or women pray for the well-being of their husband, and so that's sort of what they're doing. So that gives you context, right? And then another layer of context is that the woman who sort of looked a little bit sad in the beginning, that's Kashibai. So she's the wife of Baijiro. And Masani, who's the person that walked in later, she's the new wife of Baishiro. So, Baijiro, sorry. In terms of like figuring out why there's that emotional tension when they meet each other, this definition, this information helps us understand. So again, through context, we're able to better understand what it is we're looking at. Now, in addition to Webster's definition, I also think that context is reviewing or focusing on a part of a whole. And through focusing on a part, you are able to learn something new about the whole work. And so the part that I'm talking about can be, the time that the work takes place, the time that the work was written in, maybe the biography of an author, maybe a piece of technology that's mentioned, a specific word, information about a religion, and so much more. So this is not an extensive list. This is just stuff that I was thinking of as I was reading through some of the drafts of the autoethnographies. So, and now these aren't necessarily projects that you're working on, but I think it's still useful. If a student is working on a project about her relationship to her dogs, right? Considering context would probably mean focusing on the history of human and animal relationships. And so through focusing on that part, right, she might better understand her whole project or her whole interest in her relationship to her dogs. If you have a project about being the first one to graduate from college in a long line of women from Albania, considering context might mean focusing on the history of education in Albania. And through focusing on that part, you have a better sense of your whole project that's interested in your experiences of being in college, the first one in college. Great, so I'm going to move on from here. And so from context, we come to the critiques that I want to talk about. How are they related? Well, critiques are actually another way for us to contextualize. So it's another way for us to better understand our project, to better understand a piece of writing, to better understand an event. Criticisms or theoretical frameworks also give us the ability to investigate a problem or a question on our own, right? Because through these critiques, you're able to really rely on yourself to perform the analysis. So that's why sometimes critiques are really useful, especially when you come to the point where you feel like you're not finding a ton of outside sources. Why not then do some analysis of your own? Criticisms also, depending on, the kinds of criticisms you're performing, you often might get multiple interpretations. So if you perform a historical critique of an event, and then you perform a feminist critique of the same event, you might come away with two different interpretations, which is the point, because then from those two interpretations, it's your job to figure out how to make sense of those contradictions. Critiques are also useful because they can sort of give you questions that can start your whole project. So if you're right now feeling stuck about what your project is going to be about or how you're supposed to analyze, critiques can be useful for that as well. Okay, and just so we are all on the same page, I understand that this is not a theory class, but I also feel like theoretical frameworks, critiques, are a great way to get more comfortable with analysis, which is something that's crucial to your projects and to English composition. So, some of the critiques. We have formalist critique, psychoanalytic critique, reader response critique or reader response theory, new historicist critique, feminist critique, race theory, and these are not ones, and it's not really next class, but these are some that are also interesting to look at, but I'm not going to be talking about it here just because the lecture would then become way too long. So, formalist. Formalist critique is interested in, as it suggests, form. And so for a project, that can mean focusing on the history of a specific word. So if your project is about migration, right? And one of your projects is about migration, you might explore the history of the word migrant. And if you do that, that's actually using a formalist critique. So if you've already been doing that, then you're already a formalist. Um, Another possibility is to just think about what part of maybe if your project is interested in a film or a book or an article, focusing on a part of that film or part of that article. So if you remember Roxane Gay and Mary Phillips pieces, they're using formalist critique because Roxane Gay is really focusing on this trope of the magical Negro, right? And so her focus on that form reveals this new way to understand the help. And I think Phillips is also interested in specific characters, and that then reveals something new about if Beale Street could talk. Okay. Psychoanalytic, it's interested in, as it suggests, the mind. You're investigating the power of fear to control decision making. You're interested in feelings. You're interested in motivation. You're interested in how fear and motivation interact with one another. You're interested in this idea of the subconscious. So that is this layer of the psyche that we're not aware of, but that can still motivate how we act and what we do. All right. Reader response theory is interested in how readers can shape a text. What can we learn about a text from the way its reception has changed over time? So Gay uses this approach when she sort of compares her experience of watching The Help with the folks that are around her. How is a text transformed when given a reader? Again, Gay does this too when she looks at how The Help, when she watches it, changes in meaning as compared to The Help when someone else is watching it. So if someone else is watching it who maybe is an older white woman, they see The Help as this amazing film that sort of talks about how we've conquered racism. When she sees the film, though, the text is completely transformed into something different. New historicism, I think the most important idea here is, is the idea that time is not linear. Time is actually a continuum. And so what that means is what we're doing now is completely motivated by things that have happened in the past, and what we're doing now also plays a part in what will happen in the future. New historicist theory is also interested in the relationship between power and madness, or power and the outsider. It's interested in the way that those who have power can determine who is labeled as the outsider or the person who is mad. The Beale Street piece is an example of a new historicist critique because If Beale Street Could Talk takes place in a different time period from today, right? I believe, I don't know the exact date. I want to say 60s, but I'm not sure. So it takes place in, a time other than today, and yet Phillips, the author, talks about how the piece is related to current statistics of mortality rates for African American women, infants. So she's also, sort of collapsing time so that the present and the past and the future all exist in one. Um, Another common or another popular text that uses this approach is Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, where she looks at previous events in history to show how those events still are impacting our current justice system. Historicist is it is kind of the idea that history is linear or time is linear. It's most interested in how we can challenge interpretation of history. So the idea that history, yes, indeed is written by the victors. And so we can go back and look at certain events and challenge the way it's been interpreted, challenge the way that it's been written about. So another way that you could sort of understand this critique, looking at the history of the time it was produced, history of the time presented within the work. How does this work try to resolve issues of a real life conflict, political issue, or war? And you kind of did this type of investigating when you did the historical prompt. And so if you were really interested in this kind of writing, then you might be a historicist already. Feminist critique, this might be one that we're more familiar with. It's when you're interested in gender, sexuality, power, patriarchy, which means a male-centered perspective or a male-centered world, and gender roles. So the questions you might ask: how are the people in my project limited by their gender? What gender roles are people given? In what ways are the conflicts related to gender norms? How does patriarchy impact the world of my project? How is male power and feminine passiveness represented in my project or in the people in my project? Are women in my project working together to fight against patriarchy? Are women meant to represent one idea of femininity in my project or in the problem that I'm looking at? How much power are women given individually versus in a group? And then finally, race. This one, I mean, I can't really talk about it in like 2 minutes, but these are, I think, the most important questions to ask if you're interested in this critique. Looking at how race is constructed, looking at the limitations that are placed on folks because of race, what stereotypes are at work, and then also how race and gender intersect. And so I think that's what Mary Phillips is really interested in when she talks about the Black woman, and how often when we talk about race, we also have to remember gender. Other kinds of theories or critiques that are that you can use for this blog post: post-structuralist. So it's the idea, very briefly. So if structuralists believe that the world is here and we sort of create words to define the things that are already in the world, post-structuralists believe that we actually have language first and construct the world around us through language. And so one very popular thing that comes from this is the idea that binaries don't actually exist. So the idea that we created through language this reality that you can either be a boy or a girl or a man or a woman, but in fact that is not the case. And that's by no means the entire definition of post-structuralist, but that I think is like the briefest and clearest definition I can provide. Marxist would be interested in class. Eco-criticism would be interested in the environment, the relationship between animals and humans. Post-colonial would be interested in the way colonization impacts countries, impacts identity, And sometimes you might also look at the ways in which people, places become fragmented because of colonization. Now, just to clarify, um, all of these critiques are ways of looking at your project, a problem within your project, a person within your project, a place within your project. Um, and by looking at this project, person, place, event uh, through this lens, you might come away with a new perspective or a new understanding. I am not requiring you to use this strategy for your autoethnography. I am, though, requiring you to practice this once in the form of a blog, in the form of a discussion board post, um, so that you become familiar with what this kind of analysis involves. Now, if you feel comfortable picking up, a music video, a picture, a movie, a short story, a news article that's related to your autoethnography, and performing any of these critiques, great. If you're unsure of what work would be related to your autoethnography, then you can pick anything that you like and perform any of these critiques on it. I strongly urge that you pick something that's kind of related to your project, just because at this point in the game you want to be thinking about and working towards that final draft of the autoethnography. And just so you know, in the face-to-face class, we watched a music video, Elastic Heart, and we all tried to critique the video using one of these kinds of theories. And we then talked about like what new understanding we had of the video because of looking at this video in this perspective. So that's something you can do as well if you want the practice. Hopefully this was helpful. I will hear from you soon.